Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the Honest Youth Pastor YouTube channel, the channel that helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. Tonight, we are going to look at, talk a little bit about the Wes Huff podcast that he had with Joe Rogan. Now, if you've been on Instagram or if you've been on, I guess I posted the same meme here today. Or if you've been on my X account, you've seen me post a whole bunch about it. I have been a cheerleader for Wes for a long time, before the Joe Rogan podcast. I just want to say, OG supporter of Wes, trying to get people to find out about him. Who knew? It just took a debate and Joe Rogan to get this man off into the sunset of a lot of people knowing about him. So one of the critiques, if you've been watching online, is that it's been one of two things, right? It's been like great, huge praise that Wes did really well in the podcast, or it's been like pretty good praise, but at the same time, like some people being like negative, being like, well, Wes didn't like preach the explicit gospel to Joe on the podcast. And it's basically been one of those two things. Very few people I've seen in the middle. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. And we're going to watch one of the places that I think demonstrates something that I don't think a lot of people realize just about apologetics in general. Okay. So if you've watched the podcast, which good on you if you have, it's 3 hours long. Obviously I had to split it up all throughout my day. Almost the entirety of the podcast up until about the last 10 minutes is really Joe asking Wes a whole bunch of questions and Wes doing an incredible job actually answering him and going through some very base level things about textual criticism, base level things about manuscripts, base level things about just how to date things, and just how throughout time Christians have determined what is and is not scripture, what is and is not authoritative, and like the nuanced parts of Wes's actual job. I think if you went into this podcast thinking that there was going to be like just this explicit gospel preached to Joe Rogan and he was going to get saved on the spot, like I think you went in with the completely wrong expectations of what was going to happen or what you should have even expected to happen. Hopefully, if you've not watched any of Wes's content, you like go over to his page and you start watching a lot of his stuff, or you go on his Instagram and look through that. Wes is an academic, and he's an apologist, and he's incredibly good at his job. I interviewed him a while back, maybe a year or two ago, and even on that very short Instagram live that we did, there was a lot of things that he said that were incredibly interesting to me, that even in like Bible college, we were never told about manuscripts and dating and how how wide a range that is, and like how they can tell by ink and the papyrus written on it, all of these things, incredibly interesting things. And so if you look at apologetics and at what Wes is really good at, I think he demonstrates that really well on the Joe Rogan podcast. And a lot of people, I think, are approaching this in a way that they expected maybe a pastor or an evangelist would have approached this conversation with Rogan. But Wes isn't a pastor or an evangelist. He's a Christian apologist that knows very detailed things about manuscript and dating and papyri. And so that's what we got to see, was 3 hours and 5 minutes of somebody sitting down. And it's been a long time since I've seen a Joe Rogan podcast, by the way, so I don't know if this is sort of the flow that Rogan does now, but I know in the past, Rogan would always interrupt people, and he would always like talk over people or try to redirect the conversation or try to make the conversation go in a way that like just wherever he wanted to drive it. He didn't do that in this particular podcast. In fact, every time he did try to do that, Wes sort of did it very skillfully and brought it back around to what was the question beforehand, or sort of dove a little bit deeper into what he was talking about. And so one of the things that Wes does, I think, that all throughout the podcast, the 3 hours and 5 minutes, is answers Joe's questions the whole time. So if you're expecting Wes to blatantly present the gospel in that 3 hours and 5 minutes, I think you're looking for him to do the wrong thing. Now, he does oftentimes, over and over again, sort of slip in parts of the gospel and Christian belief and thought in answering Joe's questions. It's not until the 3 hour and 5 minute mark, so we're 10 minutes from the end of the podcast, that Wes actually turns the tables a little bit and just asks Joe a question. And that's the part I want to look at, because I think what we see, not just in modern apologetics, but just in apologetics throughout Christian history, is that apologists are not blatantly preaching the gospel as an evangelist would, or as maybe a pastor from a pulpit would. Apologists are explaining the faith with the understanding that the person they're talking to doesn't understand the nuances of the faith or what Christians actually believe, and are approaching Christianity from a completely wrong angle, and therefore you're going to have to explain to them what Christians actually believe and why Christians believe that. Apologists, even in the early church up until now, do so because they know the people they're talking to have heard the base terminology, right? So people that you talk to, either early church writings and the early church apologists, or even the apologists now, know that people have heard the terms Jesus, they've heard the term sin, they've heard the term saved, they've heard the term repentance, they've heard all of these terms, but they don't actually understand what these terms mean. So the job of an apologist, differently than it would be for an evangelist or a preacher perhaps, is to actually explain the faith in a way, a much more probably intellectual way, than you would in a quick gospel presentation or in a full-out sermon. If you don't know my stance, sermons, like the church is for believers, and therefore a sermon, the assumption is I'm preaching to believers. And so that from a church setting, from a gathering setting, that's what I'm doing. An evangelist is obviously presenting the gospel to unbelievers. That's the blatant idea of what's happening here. And usually it's in a very general way while they're explaining pieces or having one-on-one conversations as people stop. What we see Wes do on the podcast for the first 3 hours and 5 minutes is just answer Joe's questions in a way to correct the thinking, the wrong thinking that Joe has about Christian belief, other gospels, dating, authority. And you can see that Joe doesn't have a whole lot of rebuttals throughout the entire podcast. In fact, Joe pretty much shuts up almost the entire time. You almost exclusively have 3 hours of Wes just answering questions, and Joe very not very often actually interjecting anything helpful other than to ask questions. Now, one of the things that I think Wes does really good, and that he's very skilled in, is he obviously knows that Joe has a misconception of Christianity. And after Joe rattles on a little tirade about like belief and all of this, Wes does something that's very interesting. Instead of just blatantly coming at Joe, telling him he's wrong, all of this other thing, Joe asks a question, or rather, Wes asks Joe a question that is very simple. And then I want to watch what Wes does with Joe's answer. So let's go over to the review screen really quick. Now, this right here is at the 3 hour and 5 minute mark. And I think it's really, 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 it's a really skillful thing that he does here at 3 hours and 5 minutes. So let's watch this.
What is it?
Why does this, however many 3 pounds of gray matter in my brain,
Mm-hmm.
why is that able to plummet the intricacies of the universe?
Right.
Okay, so we're almost there. I apparently timed this up wrong, but we're almost there.
Right. Like, and I think that's ultimately the questions.
Way of educating people and spreading this ideology that would ultimately change the way human beings interact with each other forever. So what is he the Son of God? Well, are we all?
Okay, hold on. I skipped too far. I'm sorry. I thought I had this keyed up. Let's go over here. Here we go. I think we're there.
Rich and complicated.
Yeah, here we are.
Than any other being that exists. And why do we have this insatiable desire to learn and know more?
Yeah.
What is it?
Why does this, however many 3 pounds of gray matter in my brain, why is that able to plummet the intricacies?
I'm just going to let it play through.
Right. Like, and I think that's ultimately the questions that we should be asking in terms of you matter more than you are matter. There's something going on there.
There's something going on with all of us.
Yeah.
We kind of know it and we don't know it. But it's just, you can't measure it and you can't put it on a scale. And so people don't like that.
Yeah.
They don't like that. It makes them feel dumb to believe in that. It makes them feel dumb to even speculate, to even just say, what do you think happens when you die? Like even that conversation is like, people don't like that. Nothing. It goes dark and that's it. It's over. That's it. You die. Like, how the fuck do you know? Have you died? Like, you don't know.
In all of this, what do you think of Jesus?
Okay, so here is the interesting part that I think is really helpful. This is really, I think, where we get to the key and where we see really more of the apologetic side of Wes come out. Up until this point in the podcast, there's been a lot of information dumping, right? So Joe has asked a question and Wes answers it. Joe asks another question and Wes answers it. And Joe has very little pushback the entire time because Wes knows what he's talking about and Wes presents it in a way that any layman could just understand. Even if you don't really get a lot of the field, Wes does a great job of really dumbing it down and saying, here's kind of how we know and why we know and what we believe and all of this other stuff as an apologist. Now we get to the end, and I don't know if Wes knows the time's almost up or what's going on, but Wes now asks Joe the only question that he really asked him the entire podcast. So with all of this, he says, what do you think about Jesus? He gives Joe the time to respond, and this is what Joe says.
Like in terms of your own journeying and trying to find answers to ultimate questions. What do you think of the historical person of Jesus?
Well, it certainly seems like there's a lot of people that believe that there was this very exceptional human being that existed. So the question is, what does that mean? Does it mean he was the Son of God? Does it mean he was just some completely unique human being that had this vision of humanity and this way of educating people and spreading this ideology that would ultimately change the way human beings interact with each other forever? So what is he the Son of God? Well, are we all? That's another question, right? Do we all have that inside of us? Do we all have that ability to change everything around us inside of us? Do we all have that unique connection to the divine? And is he a representation of the best version of that? Or was he an actual person that was the Son of God? And is it important?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, what does it mean? It's just the fact that it's a question to ponder is a miracle in itself, in a way. Just the fact that there's this concept of this person that died for our sins, that's the Son of God. But you have to...
See, right there, Joe already knows the concept of Christianity. Here's the thing. We're obviously going to get to the point where Wes delves into this. But to think that Joe doesn't understand what Christianity's claims are would be unreasonable. He clearly understands what Christians' claims are about Jesus coming to die for our sins and raised from the dead. He knows that. Now, what he hasn't settled on is if that's true or not. And so he defaults and basically walks around Wes's question of who do you think Jesus is? And Joe uses a lot of well, people might believe, or they would believe this, or, Christ consciousness, or are we all divine? He really tries to avoid the question here. And so Wes, again, this isn't just from an apologetic perspective, but Wes approaches this, I think, in a very apologetic manner, knowing that Joe is dancing around the question. And instead of addressing Joe directly on all of these claims that he just made about Christ consciousness, or are we all divine, or how do we know, and dancing around it, he says this.
You have to believe in a bunch of stuff to go that way. Like, just the concept of that is interesting to people, because what it can do to people is offer them a very unique way to change the way they feel about the world itself. And if you do follow that, I know a lot of Christians that are hardcore Christians that are some of the nicest people you'll ever meet in your life. So it does work. Right? Like, if you do live like...
Also notice that Wes is letting him just kind of talk all the way through this. He's not interrupting him. He's not trying to correct him along the way. He's letting Joe get all of his thoughts out on the question of who do you think Jesus is. And Joe isn't really answering the question. He's giving a lot of kind of whataboutisms, I know about, like but we're getting a lot of what Joe's base theology, or at least understanding, is about Christianity. And Wes is letting him do this, which I think is a great thing to do. Just asking a question and letting somebody fully answer it before you kind of interject.
Like a Christian, and you do follow the principles of Christ, you will have a richer, more love-filled life. So it is true. Right? But you have to submit to this concept that this guy was the child of God who came down to earth, let himself be crucified, came back from the dead, explained a bunch of stuff for people, and then said, all right, see you when I come back.
And you don't know how you can wrap your head around that particular claim.
And if he came back, here's the thing. If he came back, who the fuck would believe him today? With all the fake news and all the CGI.
Also, sorry about I completely forgot Joe cursed so much in this.
And AI, like, imagine, that would be the most bizarre thing of all time. If we get to a point where artificial reality is indiscernible from regular reality, and Jesus chooses to come back at that moment, boy, that's the ultimate test of faith. Right? When it's impossible to discern. If we really reach a point where virtual reality is indistinguishable from regular reality, which we're probably 100 years away from that or something. Like, how far? Maybe not even that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's probably why Jesus came in the 1st century and not the 21st century.
But imagine if that's the big catch. Like, Jesus does return, but when he returns, we're just so confused that we can't even tell.
Yeah.
Or maybe that's how he returns in the first place. Maybe he returns through AI.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the portal to Jesus.
I don't know anything about that. Yeah, I mean,
that scares the shit out of me.
I really appreciate, guys that you're friends with, right? Like,
okay, so here's the thing. He asked him a question. He let him talk all the way through it. And now he's already said, like, okay, so that's the thing you can't get your mind around. That's the thing you're having trouble with, is that you have to believe these claims that Joe clearly understands about the gospel. Joe understands that Christians claim that Jesus was born of a virgin. They've already talked about that in the podcast. He knows that Christians believe that Jesus died for the sins of the world. He understands that. He stated that. He understands that Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead. He understands that. And he's saying, like, he can't wrap his mind around those claims being reality. And so Wes lets Joe kind of talk all this out. He then says, okay, so that's what you can't get your mind around. And then he comes at this from the side, not addressing Joe straight on, but knowing that Joe has picked up these ideas somewhere. And he addresses it via Justin Peterson, which he knows that he's friends with. What I want you to see is that I think if you go into this podcast wanting Wes to come out with an ABC presentation of the gospel in order to try to convince Joe Rogan to become a Christian, you came at this podcast entirely wrong. Because that would assume that Joe doesn't already understand what Christians believe. He has a base understanding of what Christians believe. He's talked to enough people. He's read enough stuff. He stated in this podcast he watched 20 hours of Wes's content before they even sat down to talk. Like, he gets the base level of what Christians believe. He just can't wrap his mind around it. So Wes isn't here necessarily to present the base understanding of Christianity. Wes, as an apologist, which really in essence all Christians should be a bit of an apologist and apply an apologetic while we're talking to people. is now going to come at this really at the root of the issue. It's not that Joe doesn't understand the gospel. It's that Joe has a misconception of who Jesus is and what the gospel means. And so Wes here, I think in the best part of the entire podcast, actually comes at this in a way that is incredibly helpful. If you've not seen the podcast, here's the part that I think is really the gem in all of this.
The Jordan Petersons and the Douglas Murrays of the world, or, the Tom Hollands, not the Spider-Man actor, the historian, who talk about this stuff. I think I really like the way that Jordan Peterson articulates it, but I think he misses the forest for the trees.
How so?
In that he sees Jesus as an archetype. And I don't think actually even Jesus gives you the opportunity to see him as the archetype. Because I have this love-hate relationship with all of Peterson's stuff, because he seems to get so much right where he walks up to the line, but he doesn't want to cross over.
And is the crossover, you think, connected to a life in academia? Or
No.
What do you think it is?
I wonder, and I'd love to talk to him about this, like how do you remedy this issue that, because he seems to think that the concept of Jesus as an example.
You see what he's doing? He's saying Jordan Peterson thinks that the concept of Jesus as an example is something to be obtained, which is exactly what Joe basically just communicated. Even though he goes on to state, I know Christians believe this, but what if Jesus is just this great example of what it means to be like ultimately human, and he was just laying out this ultimate human path for us. And so Wes like knows that Joe understands the base concepts. An apologist's job is to correct the misunderstanding of those base concepts, which is what he's doing right here.
Is more important than the actual flesh and blood first century itinerant Jewish preacher who was crucified and rose from the dead physically, which is the claim of the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. That's an example for us to look on and live by. But I actually think that Jesus condemns moralism. And ultimately what I see Peterson doing is looking at Jesus as a moral example. And if Jesus is nothing but a moral example, then you can save yourself and you don't actually need a savior. And so I think actually Jesus would have critiqued that, because Jesus was very against moralism.
And how do you define Jesus being against moralism? Like, what do you mean?
Okay, so you see what is happening. The reason Joe is asking follow-up questions is because now Wes is actually pushing on the misconception Joe has. One of the things I think we need to realize is that oftentimes when we're talking to people or trying to work through people's worldview, when we ask them the question, we interject as they're answering it, and we don't even get to really the core issue of what their disbelief or problem is with like Christian belief. Wes lets Joe just ramble on. In there, he has nuggets of this is really what Joe's kind of trying to get at. Understands Joe's friends with Justin Peterson, comes in at that angle because that's a lot of what Justin Peterson connects with as far as Jesus as the example. And now he's addressing the core issue that Joe didn't come flat out and say, but was really getting around to. And Wes is using that in order to really clarify the base ideas that Joe has in a clarifying way, as apologists do, so that Joe now has some clarity on what the gospel really means.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, Jesus looks at the religiosity of his day with like particular groups like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are these other groups of Jews during his day. So we talked about the Essenes, who actually aren't mentioned in the Bible, but there are other groups like the Pharisees, who are like lay scholars, and the Sadducees, who are professional priest scholars. And he's constantly critiquing the fact that they have this hypocritical religiosity to them, where they're doing things like tithing their mint leaves, like to make sure that they get all of. This is where we get the idea of the letter of the law versus the intention of the law. Like Jesus critiques them for that, because he says, you're trying to do everything right and you're missing the point. So one of the things he says is like, if your donkey falls in a ravine on the Sabbath, do you pull it out? Or does that work? Like, what's the point of the Sabbath? Is it to not do any work? Like, is it to make sure that you're not working too hard because you might be breaking the Sabbath? Or like, what is the point? He says, like, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that there's this intention. This is the whole Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, is he keeps saying, you have heard it said, but I say, and he refers to the Mosaic Law. And it looks like he's critiquing the Mosaic Law, but he's not actually. He's getting back to the intention of the law. So when he says, you know, you have heard it said, do not commit murder, but I say to you, anybody who harbors a hate for their brother in their heart has already committed murder. And what he's getting to is like, what's the intention? What's the meaning of the law that God gives to you? Because the law is like a mirror. It shows you how dirty you are. But his critique is, he's like, you guys are trying to clean yourself with a mirror. That's stupid. It's just going to, if anything, it's going to make you more messy. Like, get in.
Okay, so I don't want to read too much into the groans of Joe Rogan, because I think you could go pretty deep there and be completely wrong. But it does seem that as Wes is actually digging behind Joe's belief and his base understanding of what he's been told the gospel is, what he's been told sin is, what he's been told the purpose of the crucifixion and resurrection is, as he's digging behind this, Wes is really chipping away, as apologetics are meant to do, at the misunderstanding of what people think Jesus' life, death, resurrection mean. You see, it's not that people haven't heard the gospel, right? Joe clearly, he already articulated the base understanding of what the gospel means. Wes here is just presenting him with the correct version and leaving it on the table for him to either understand or throw away, but at least he's correcting it so that he's not ignorant of the reality that Jesus is more than just the perfect human that you should follow and live, and because of that, you'll live a better life. That is not the point. And so Wes takes the thing that Joe says about Jesus being like the perfect human or the perfect example, and he kind of digs down on that. And how does he know to dig down on that? Because he asked Joe a question, he let Joe go all the way through it, and then he digs down on it and says, okay, well, this is where I think Jordan gets it wrong. And ultimately what he's really doing is sort of a Jesus at the woman in the well situation, where he's actually also really getting at Rogan's misconception as well at the end of the day, and correcting his incorrect thinking about this Jesus that's just an example.
In the shower. The law is not what cleans you. The law is what reveals that you're dirty. And so in that sense, I think, if Jesus is a moral example, it actually misses what I think Jesus actually said about what his purpose was, in that you can't do enough to actually live up to the standard that God holds you to. And so if you keep striving, you're actually going to wear yourself out and be exhausted.
Like atheists.
I didn't say you did, Joe.
A lot of them go crazy. They go crazy when they get older.
Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, Wes, this is...
Okay, so then Joe just ends the podcast really, really quickly. Now, there's a lot of speculation, like, why did Joe end the podcast so soon? Was he convicted? I don't know. It's at 3 hours and 13 minutes that he ends the podcast. They've talked about a lot up to this point. Honestly, listening to the podcast, I couldn't tell if Joe was genuinely interested in what Wes was saying or if he was just bored with it. It came off at times as if Joe was just bored with the information, but he already had Wes there. But that was just my read of it. There was other times where Joe seemed genuinely interested in what Wes was telling him, and it piqued his interest. I don't think Joe is overly a religious person. I think he is interested in religion. And Wes, on this podcast, I think did a great job of really unpacking things that oftentimes even Christians that are sitting in church every Sunday don't know about the scriptures. And so a lot of the critique that people are giving Wes on this podcast is that he didn't preach the gospel clear enough. He didn't press back hard enough. He didn't go in hard on Joe like he could have. I think if you're coming at that and saying, did Wes preach the gospel to Joe Rogan? Did he do the thing that we needed him to do? I think you're coming at it in a completely weird way. Wes was on the podcast to explain why he was able to speak in the authoritative way that he was and why he was so knowledgeable on the documents that he was knowledgeable on when he debated Carson. And I think Carson. I got the name wrong in the last video I did. You guys know what I'm talking about, though. And so that's why he was on the podcast. They spend a good amount of time at the beginning talking about that, and then Joe sort of segues into having Wes explain his history, his education, and then Joe asks him questions that he has sometimes based on Wes's education. And honestly, one of the things I think Wes also does really well is say, I don't know, when Joe asks him questions that Wes just doesn't know. Wes is incredibly, the interactions I've had with him, I think it comes through here as well, is an incredibly humble individual. He knows what he knows, and he knows he doesn't know what he doesn't know. And so there's a point in the podcast some people are giving Wes like grief on where like they say he didn't press back hard enough on evolution. And Wes, again, as an apologist, simply says, I'm not a scientist, but here's what the Christian scriptures say, and this is the Christian position. And he just throws that out there. Oftentimes, apologists are not evangelists. And as hard as you want them to be evangelists, they're not evangelists. Apologists are just presenting Christian thought, leaving it on the table and saying, you have to deal with this factual information. There it is. But now it's on you. The ball is in your court to deal with the reality of what Christians really believe. And you can't strawman Christianity because here the clarity of what Christians truly believe has been presented to you. And so Wes, all throughout this podcast, I think does a great job of unpacking that, explaining that, describing that, teaching that. And then we get to that last 10 minutes or so. And Wes really presents the gospel in a very particular way after Joe sort of reveals his issue with really wrapping his mind around it. That's why I would encourage you to watch the whole thing, because it's informative, but it's also, I really think, a masterclass on how to have a really good dialogue with unbelievers that have legitimate questions in such a way that you ask them the question, you let them sort of tell you their belief, and then you go through and you sort of break that down and be like, all right, so you believe this, but this is what Christians really believe. How would you deal with that aspect? And you have a dialogue. If you were expecting Wes to come and just say, you're a sinner in need of a savior, here's the gospel, I think you came to the podcast with the absolute wrong expectations. Because Wes is an apologist, he presented the information to Joe. Joe likes to deal with information, and Wes put that all on the table and said, there you go. There it is. Joe actually invited him back to come back and do sort of a debate with somebody that disagrees with Wes. We'll see if that actually happens. I think that would be helpful because Joe also knows, it seemed like in this podcast, that he does not have a clue about like anything that Wes was talking about. So he couldn't really push back because Wes knows this stuff. And so hopefully it planted some seeds, and it gives, even if it doesn't affect Rogan, it puts some seeds out there for people that watch the podcast that say, oh, wow, like there's a lot more legitimacy to the Christian scriptures and the Christian's teaching than I thought there were. So did Wes Huff preach the gospel to Joe Rogan? I think he did. He did it in a way in which he's answering Joe's objections and misconceptions of Jesus, which I think really is the most effective way to do it. He could have went out and did a general blanket statement of the gospel, but instead he says, what do you think of Jesus? And Joe, ultimately, if you sum it up, really thinks of Jesus as a moral teacher that maybe you should follow. And Wes takes that information and comes at it with the reality that Jesus is far more than a moral teacher. And if that's all you see him as, you don't understand who he is. All that being said, hopefully this was helpful. I know some of you got clickbait into it, raged bait into this with the title. If you stuck around this far, I'm glad you're here. Because at the end of the day, I think Wes is a great example for all of us as believers in a way of how to approach unbelievers in our lives that have questions, that are in similar positions of Joe, and we have an opportunity to know about our faith. We have resources such as Wes to learn about our faith more than we already know, and then present that in a way that says, okay, well, here's the information. You have to do something with it now. I think that's probably the most effective way to go about it. And that's the way we see Christian apologists and Christians in general deal with people all throughout history. Here's the gospel. Here's the correction to your misunderstanding of the gospel. Now, what do you do with that information? Guys, I hope you thought it was helpful. If you did, make sure you like it. That helps the algorithm. Also, if you thought it was helpful, share it with somebody else as well. And if you're not subscribed, what is the problem? We go live every single night to talk about topics that I've thought about or seen during the day, and I'll see you tomorrow.